The sound of a single key, metallic and cold, slid across polished mahogany. It came to rest at the edge of the vast, empty desk.
For 20 years, that key had opened the ornate gate to a sprawling estate, a sanctuary of wealth and solitude. Now, it felt like an anchor.
Arthur Caldwell knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that its purpose had shifted. It no longer represented entry, it signified an end.
Arthur Caldwell built his empire on steel and stone, a mosaic of gleaming skyscrapers and prime real estate that reshaped skylines in a dozen cities.
His name was whispered with a reverence reserved for titans, his net worth a figure that defied easy comprehension. Yet, beneath the veneer of colossal success, Arthur lived a life of quiet, profound solitude.
His sprawling penthouse in Manhattan, his lavish weekend estate in the Hamptons, his private jet, they were monuments to an existence largely devoid of genuine human connection.
Business partners were transactional. Social acquaintances were superficial.
Women, for many years, had been fleeting distractions, their affections often too transparently tied to his considerable fortune.
He understood the game and played it with a detached pragmatism, always keeping a formidable emotional distance. This distance, he had come to believe, was the price of his particular genius.
It was also, he admitted to the quiet corners of his mind, a heavy burden. He was a man who owned the world, but rarely felt truly seen by anyone in it. His days ended with the silence of empty rooms, his nights with the echoes of his own thoughts, a persistent hum of loneliness.
Then, a subtle shift occurred. It was not a grand event, but a series of small, almost imperceptible changes.
Arthur, usually cloistered, found himself at a charity gala, an obligatory appearance he typically endured with practiced patience.
Across the room, amidst the glittering crowd and the din of polite conversation, he saw her, Lena Petrova.
She stood apart, not in an overt attempt to gain attention, but with an almost natural grace that seemed untouched by the ostentation around her. Her dress was simple, her smile unforced.
There was a directness in her gaze, a warmth that seemed to cut through the polished indifference of the room. She was working the event, a volunteer from a small, struggling arts foundation. They spoke for what felt like moments, yet stretched into an hour. She did not know his name, or if she did, she gave no indication of its weight.
She spoke of her passion for art, her humble upbringing, the small community she worked to support. Her stories were devoid of pretense, infused with a raw honesty that Arthur found disarming, almost alien.
She had a simple kindness about her, a refreshing contrast to the calculated charm he was so accustomed to. He found himself drawn to the quiet strength in her eyes, the gentle cadence of her voice.
It was a sensation he had not felt in decades, a flicker of something akin to genuine interest, an unfamiliar warmth thawing the edges of his guarded heart.
He pursued her, not with the aggressive confidence he employed in business, but with a cautious tenderness. Dinners were arranged, discreetly at first, then more openly. He learned of her small apartment, her shared responsibilities for a younger sister, her unwavering dedication to her family.
Her life was a stark counterpoint to his own opulence, a world of modest means and close-knit ties. This disparity, he mused, was part of her appeal. She seemed untainted by the pursuit of material gain. He found solace in her simple pleasures, her easy laughter. She listened to him, truly listened, with an empathy that surprised him.
He began to confide in her, speaking of the isolation that came with his wealth, the constant vigilance, the fear of being used.
Lena met his fears with understanding, her touch soft, her words reassuring. She was a haven, a quiet harbor in the storm of his existence. He saw in her the possibility of a different life, a life where genuine affection could exist, untainted by the shadow of his fortune. Their relationship blossomed over months,
a delicate hothouse flower carefully cultivated away from the prying eyes of the media. Arthur felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years.
Then the first subtle request arrived. Lena's sister, she explained, needed a minor medical procedure. Nothing major, but their family savings were stretched thin. Could Arthur, perhaps, offer a small loan? It was framed as an acute embarrassment, a reluctant plea from a proud woman. Arthur, enveloped in the glow of his newfound happiness, saw it as an opportunity to help, a small gesture of his affection. He readily agreed, dismissing the sum as negligible.
It was a simple act, a small crack in the dam, unnoticed at the time, but significant in retrospect. The requests became more frequent, more substantial, yet always presented with the same gentle hesitancy, the same accompanying apologies. Her brother, a talented but struggling artist, needed seed money for a gallery showing. Her elderly parents, their modest home in need of urgent repairs, faced a daunting financial burden.
Each request was framed as an absolute necessity, a desperate measure, an unfortunate circumstance that only Arthur, with his vast resources, could resolve.
Lena would lament their family's constant struggles, her own sense of helplessness, and then, almost reluctantly, propose a solution involving Arthur's generosity. He found himself increasingly involved in the intricate tapestry of the Petrova family's lives.
He paid for medical bills, covered tuition fees, renovated their ancestral home, funded their small, seemingly destined to fail businesses. He became their benefactor, their patron saint.
Lena's gratitude was effusive, her family's deference absolute. They treated him with a reverence that bordered on worship, praising his kindness, his wisdom, his generosity. This praise, this sense of being needed and appreciated, was a potent balm to Arthur's long-standing loneliness. He rationalized it as the cost of true love, the natural exchange in building a family.
After all, what was money to him when it brought such warmth and companionship? He was building not just a relationship, but a new family, a true home. One crisp autumn evening, under the soft glow of 1,000 tiny lights on his Hamptons estate, Arthur proposed. Lena, her eyes brimming with what appeared to be genuine tears, accepted. The engagement was announced quietly, a small affair for close friends and Lena's immediate family. This, Arthur believed, was the culmination of his journey, the final piece of his life's puzzle.
He was no longer just a titan of industry. He was a man about to be married, about to embark on a life intertwined with a woman he believed loved him for himself.
Yet, with the engagement, a subtle shift in the dynamic occurred. The requests, once hesitant whispers, now arrived with an undercurrent of expectation, a sense of entitlement. Lena's family began to voice opinions on his financial decisions, suggest investments in their own ventures, propose elaborate plans for family expansions that would inevitably require Arthur's considerable backing.
Her cousin needed capital to expand his struggling restaurant. Her uncle, a retired mechanic, suddenly discovered a latent entrepreneurial spirit, requiring funds for a dubious import-export business.
A sprawling holiday home for the entire Petrova clan, a necessary family retreat, became a frequent topic of discussion.
Lena, who once seemed embarrassed by her family's needs, now presented these demands with a quiet insistence, weaving them into their future plans, as if these expenditures were a natural, even expected, part of their impending union.
Arthur, for the first time, felt a prickle of unease. He dismissed it initially as the natural friction of two vastly different worlds colliding, but the unease persisted, growing into a dull ache. He noticed small things. Lena's phone conversations suddenly cut short when he entered the room, an almost imperceptible hardness in her eyes when he hesitated on a financial request. The way her family's smiles seemed to brighten disproportionately at the mention of money. He began to observe Lena more critically. Her gentle empathy, once so appealing, now sometimes felt rehearsed. Her stories, once so candid, occasionally contained minor inconsistencies.
He started to recall specific phrases, repeated almost verbatim, that her sister had used to describe her own needs, and then, weeks later, Lena would use the same phrasing for another relative's supposed crisis.
The warmth that had once enveloped him began to feel stifling, then suffocating. He found himself walking through his vast home, a sense of dread pooling in his gut.
The silence of his pre-Lena life, once a burden, now seemed almost preferable to the constant, subtle pressure. He was entangled, not just financially, but emotionally.
He had invested so much hope, so much of his long-dormant desire for connection into this relationship. To admit now that it might be a fabrication, a meticulously crafted illusion, was to admit to a catastrophic failure of judgment, a profound vulnerability he had always striven to avoid. The shame of it would be unbearable, the public humiliation a scandal he could not fathom.
More crippling, perhaps, was the prospect of returning to his desolate solitude, the fear that this was his last chance at genuine love, however flawed it might appear. He sought counsel, obliquely at first, from a trusted old friend, a retired judge. He spoke of a hypothetical situation, a friend who found himself in a complex family dynamic. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, then offered a quiet observation. When generosity becomes an expectation, it ceases to be generosity. It becomes a transaction.
And in such transactions, someone is always paying too much. Arthur heard the words, but they echoed in an empty chamber. He was too deeply entrenched, too emotionally compromised.
He was paying too much, yes, but what was the alternative? To walk away was to lose Lena, to lose the illusion, and perhaps to lose the last vestiges of his own hope. The internal collapse was slow, agonizing. He started spending more time alone, sequestered in his study, poring over legal documents, his gaze distant.
He noticed how his staff, usually so deferential, began to regard him with a mixture of pity and concern. He suspected they knew, or at least sensed, the shift in his world. He overheard snippets of conversations, hushed tones, references to that family. The whispers were a confirmation of his deepest fears, a chilling validation of his growing paranoia. He began to test Lena, subtly at first. He would delay approving a payment, citing a temporary liquidity issue, an upcoming large investment.
Her reaction was always swift, a flash of something cold and sharp in her eyes, quickly masked by a worried smile. "Is everything all right, my love?"
She would ask, her voice laced with concern, but the underlying message was clear. His resources were her family's safety net, and that net must never fray.
He started asking detailed questions about the businesses he was funding, requesting receipts, business plans, proof of actual investment.
The documents provided were always vague, superficial, filled with optimistic projections and little substance. When he pressed, Lena would grow agitated, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by a defensive edge. "Don't you trust me, Arthur?" she would ask, her voice trembling, her eyes welling with tears. "Don't you trust my family?" And in that moment, faced with her apparent distress, his resolve would crumble. He would apologize, assure her of his love, and sign the checks.
His days became a series of quiet observations. He watched Lena interact with her family, the easy familiarity, the unspoken signals.
He saw their triumphant glances when a large transfer went through, their casual disregard for the vast sums he was pouring into their lives. The facade of humble gratitude had worn thin, revealing a calculated exploitation. He was a resource, a bottomless well from which to draw. He was the mark.
The realization was a devastating blow, not a sudden revelation, but a slow, insidious poisoning of the spirit. He felt like an empty vessel, drained of his hope, his dignity, his very self. The man who had built an empire was now a pawn in a game orchestrated by a family he had tried to love. Yet he could not leave. The emotional bonds, however twisted, still held him captive.
The public humiliation, the potential scandal, the sheer magnitude of his financial losses, these were powerful deterrents. But more than that, it was the deep-seated fear of returning to utter solitude, the admission that he had been so utterly, completely wrong. He had sought warmth and found a fire that burned him alive. He tried to confide in Lena, to express his feelings of being overwhelmed, of being used.
He spoke of his desire for a simpler life with her, one not constantly burdened by financial demands. She listened, her hand resting gently on his, her eyes filled with an almost perfect imitation of sympathy.
She promised things would change, that she would talk to her family, that their love was paramount. For a fleeting moment, he almost believed her.
But the next day, another request would arrive, perhaps from a distant cousin or an ailing aunt, and the cycle would begin anew. Arthur began to make quiet arrangements. He reviewed his will, making revisions that would, he hoped, protect a portion of his assets for charitable causes, for distant, unconnected beneficiaries, away from the grasping hands that now surrounded him.
He knew the risk he was taking. His actions were a silent defiance, a subtle act of resistance against the inevitable. He began to keep meticulous records of all the financial transfers, the emails, the conversations. He tucked them away in a secure, remote location, a whisper of a plan, an unspoken insurance policy. He was not sure what he was preparing for, only that he needed to be prepared. The cold certainty that he was living on borrowed time had settled over him, a cloak of resignation.
He moved through his days with a quiet dignity, a man awaiting his fate. The grand estate, once a symbol of his achievement, became a gilded cage. Lena, once his escape, was now his jailer. He watched her and her family with a detached, clinical gaze, seeing them not as loved ones, but as predators. The affection he once felt had curdled into a bitter understanding, a profound sadness for what might have been. He had sought love and found a mirror reflecting his deepest fears back at him.
The night he died, it was a quiet affair. No struggle, no outcry, just a sudden, unexpected illness, a swift decline attributed to his advanced age and a weak heart. The details were murky, the death certificate signed without much scrutiny. Lena was inconsolable, a picture of devastated grief. Her family, supportive and stoic, stood by her side. Arthur Caldwell, the titan who owned the world, was gone.
His will, upon reading, revealed a meticulous division of his estate. A substantial sum went to Lena, his fiancée, as expected. But a significant portion, unexpectedly, was directed to a labyrinth of obscure charities and trust funds for distant, often unknown relatives. It was a final, almost poetic act of defiance, a subtle rerouting of wealth away from the hands he knew sought to claim it all.
It was not enough to save him, but it was enough to sting, to leave a bitter aftertaste for those who believed they had won everything. The Petrova family inherited what they could, their initial triumph muted by the complexities of the will. Life for them, ostensibly, improved. They acquired homes, cars, a veneer of respectability. Lena, after a decent period of mourning, moved into one of Arthur's smaller properties, leading a comfortable, if somewhat shadowed, existence. But the ghost of Arthur Caldwell lingered.
His story, whispered in financial circles, became a cautionary tale, a chilling testament to the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful men. His fate raises questions that linger in the quiet spaces of our understanding. What drives such calculated predation? What is the true cost of loneliness, of a yearning for connection so profound it blinds a man to the glaring truth. Arthur Caldwell sought a love that would fill the vast emptiness within him.
He found, instead, a mirror reflecting a deeper, more chilling void in the human heart.
Perhaps the greatest tragedy was not just his death, but the slow, agonizing death of his hope, his trust, his very belief in genuine affection. His story is a somber reminder of the delicate balance between vulnerability and vigilance, and the shadows that can lurk in the pursuit of the most fundamental human need.
What does it truly mean to give oneself over entirely to another? And when does love cease to be love, transforming instead into a carefully orchestrated extraction?